Lieutenant Sarah Martinez had always known she was different. Not because of her gender, though that certainly made her stand out in the testosterone-filled world of Navy SEALs. It was something deeper than that. While other recruits complained about the grueling training, the bone-crushing exhaustion, and the mental warfare that instructors inflicted upon them, Sarah found herself quietly thriving. Where others broke, she bent and snapped back stronger. The hell week that had claimed 60% of her class barely left a mark on her. While grown men twice her size collapsed from hypothermia in the frigid Pacific waters, Sarah's compact frame and iron will carried her through. She had learned long ago that survival wasn't about size or strength alone. It was about the fire that burned inside when everything else failed. But now, 18 months after earning her trident and becoming one of only a handful of women to complete SEAL training, Sarah found herself questioning whether earning the right to serve had been worth the daily battle for respect that followed. The briefing room at Naval Special Warfare Command buzzed with the usual pre-mission energy. 24 operators sat around the table, their attention focused on the intelligence officer who was outlining their next deployment to Syria. Sarah occupied her usual seat in the back corner, notebook open, taking detailed notes while her teammates leaned back in their chairs with casual confidence. "The target compound is here," the intelligence officer pointed to the satellite imagery projected on the wall. 3 buildings, possible civilians in the area, and at least 12 confirmed hostiles with automatic weapons and RPGs. Commander Jake Mitchell, the team leader, raised his hand. "What's our extraction timeline?" 40 minutes from insertion to pickup. Any longer and you'll have half the Syrian army breathing down your necks. Sarah studied the compound layout, noting the narrow alleyways and multiple escape routes. Her mind automatically began calculating angles of approach, identifying potential sniper positions, and mapping fallback positions. It was the same tactical analysis every SEAL in the room was conducting, but somehow her contributions to these discussions always seemed to fall on deaf ears. "Martinez," Commander Mitchell called out without looking in her direction, "you'll be handling comms from the bird." The words hit her like a slap. Communications duty meant staying with the helicopter while her team went into harm's way. It was a support role, critical but removed from the actual action. For the 3rd mission in a row, she was being relegated to the sidelines. "Sir, I'd like to request a position in the assault team," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady and professional despite the frustration burning in her chest. The room fell silent. 23 pairs of eyes turned toward her, some with amusement, others with barely concealed annoyance. Commander Mitchell finally looked up from his notes, his expression unreadable. "Martinez, communications is a vital role. Someone needs to coordinate with air support and maintain contact with base." "I understand that, sir. But Petty Officer Johnson has more experience on comms, and I've logged more hours on close quarters combat training than anyone else on the team this quarter." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. It was true, and everyone in the room knew it. Sarah had spent every free hour at the shooting house, perfecting her room-clearing techniques and weapon transitions. Her scores on the combat fitness tests consistently ranked in the top 3, often beating men who had been operators for years longer than she had. Petty Officer First Class Tony Rodriguez, a 10-year veteran with forearms like tree trunks, let out a low chuckle. "Look, Martinez, nobody's questioning your scores, but this isn't the training range. When bullets start flying for real, you need someone who can keep their head straight." "Are you suggesting I can't?" Sarah's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "I'm suggesting that maybe you should stick to what you know works instead of trying to prove something." The implication stung because it reflected an attitude Sarah had encountered repeatedly since joining the teams. No matter how well she performed in training, how many records she broke, or how many certifications she earned, there always seemed to be an invisible barrier preventing her from being treated as an equal member of the unit. Commander Mitchell held up a hand before the exchange could escalate. "The assignments stand. Martinez on comms, Johnson takes point with Rodriguez, meeting dismissed." As the room emptied, Sarah remained in her seat, staring at the satellite images still projected on the wall. She traced the compound's perimeter with her eyes, visualizing how she would approach each building, where she would position her team members, what contingencies she would prepare for. The tactical plan forming in her mind was solid, probably better than what they would actually implement. "You know, constantly challenging orders isn't going to win you any friends." Sarah turned to find Lieutenant Commander Alex Kane standing behind her. Kane was one of the few operators who had never openly dismissed her abilities, though he had never actively supported her either. He occupied that neutral ground that Sarah had learned to appreciate, even if it fell short of true allyship. "I'm not trying to win friends," she replied, closing her notebook. "I'm trying to do the job I trained for. Sometimes the job means following orders, even when you don't agree with them. And sometimes following orders means accepting limitations that have nothing to do with capability." Kane pulled out the chair next to her and sat down. "Look, I get it. You feel like you're not being utilized properly, but Mitchell's not some old-school dinosaur who thinks women belong in the kitchen. He's got to think about team cohesion." "Team cohesion," Sarah repeated the phrase with obvious skepticism. "Is that what we're calling it?" "What would you call it?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering how to voice thoughts she had been wrestling with for months. "I call it a test I can never pass. Every mission I prove myself again. Every training exercise I outperform expectations. Every evaluation I score in the top tier, but somehow it's never enough to change how I'm perceived." Kane studied her face, seeing something there that made him choose his words carefully. "You think this is about gender. I think this is about assumptions, about what people see when they look at me versus what I've actually demonstrated I can do." Outside the briefing room, the base hummed with activity. Personnel moved between buildings with purpose, their conversations mixing technical jargon with the casual banter that marked military units worldwide. Sarah had once found comfort in being part of this machine, this precisely calibrated organization where merit supposedly determined advancement. Now she wondered if she had been naive to believe that official policies could override unconscious biases that ran deeper than regulations. The Syrian deployment would be her 15th mission with the team. In those previous 14 operations, she had never once been assigned to the primary assault element. She had provided sniper cover, handled logistics coordination, managed communications, and served as backup for various contingencies. Each role had been performed flawlessly, earning commendations that filled her personnel file but somehow never translated into increased trust or responsibility. "Martinez," Petty Officer Rodriguez called from the doorway. "Gear inspection in 30 minutes. Make sure your radio equipment is squared away." The casual dismissal in his tone was familiar by now. It was the voice of someone addressing a subordinate, even though they held the same rank. Sarah had heard that tone directed at her countless times, from countless people who would never dream of speaking that way to a male peer. She gathered her materials and headed toward the equipment bay, passing groups of operators discussing the upcoming mission with the easy confidence of men who had never had to question their place in the unit. Their conversations flowed with shared assumptions about roles, capabilities, and expectations that Sarah found herself perpetually outside of. In the equipment room, she methodically checked each piece of communications gear, testing frequencies, verifying encryption protocols, and ensuring backup systems functioned properly. The work was familiar and methodical, requiring the same attention to detail that had made her successful in every aspect of her military career. But as she worked, her mind wandered to alternative scenarios where her tactical knowledge and combat skills would be put to better use. The truth was, Sarah had never wanted to be a symbol or a trailblazer. She had simply wanted to serve her country in the capacity where she could make the greatest difference. The Navy SEALs represented the pinnacle of military capability, the sharp edge of American Special Operations Forces. Earning her place among them had required sacrificing everything else in her life, enduring physical and mental challenges that most people could not imagine surviving. Yet here she was, preparing once again to watch from the sidelines while others executed missions she could perform as well or better than anyone on the team. The frustration was not about ego or recognition. It was about the waste of capability, the inefficient allocation of resources that any military organization should abhor. "Hey, Martinez," Petty Officer Johnson approached with his own communications equipment. "Mitchell wants me to walk you through the backup protocols for tomorrow." The irony was not lost on her. Johnson, a solid operator with adequate technical skills, would be receiving instruction from the person who actually possessed superior expertise in the subject matter. But protocol demanded that she listen respectfully while he explained procedures she could teach better than he could. As Johnson launched into his explanation, Sarah nodded at appropriate intervals while mentally reviewing the mission parameters once more. The target compound presented several tactical challenges that would require split-second decision-making and adaptability under fire. The narrow approach routes limited options for assault teams, while the proximity of civilian structures demanded precise fire control and careful movement. Her analysis suggested that a smaller, more agile assault element would be preferable to the larger team Mitchell had authorized. Fewer operators meant less chance of detection during approach, faster movement through the compound, and simplified coordination during extraction. But such strategic insights from Sarah seemed to carry less weight than casual observations from her male counterparts. The equipment inspection concluded without incident, each piece of gear meeting the exacting standards that special operations demanded. Sarah's communications suite was, as always, properly maintained and fully functional. She had never once failed an equipment inspection, never once experienced gear failure during an operation, never once been the weak link in any mission chain. Yet tomorrow she would once again find herself in a supporting role while others took point, as if 18 months of flawless performance had not been sufficient to demonstrate her readiness for primary responsibilities. The pattern had become so predictable that she found herself questioning not just her current assignment, but her entire career trajectory within the special operations community. Walking back to her quarters as the sun set over the California coastline, Sarah reflected on the conversation she would have with her family during their weekly video call. Her parents, both academics who had supported her unconventional career choice despite their own reservations, would ask about her latest deployments with their characteristic mixture of pride and concern. How could she explain that the challenge was no longer the enemy or the missions, but the daily struggle to be seen as an equal member of her own unit? How could she convey the exhaustion that came not from physical demands, but from constantly having to prove worthiness that should have been established long ago? Her quarters were Spartan but comfortable, reflecting the transient nature of military life and her own minimal personal needs. Photos of family members shared wall space with certificates of completion from various advanced training courses. The contrast highlighted the dual nature of her existence, the personal relationships that grounded her identity and the professional achievements that defined her capabilities. Sarah sat at her desk and opened her laptop, intending to review intelligence reports related to tomorrow's mission. Instead, she found herself staring at a blank document, cursor blinking expectantly as thoughts she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge demanded expression. The truth was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Despite her qualifications, despite her performance record, despite her unwavering commitment to the mission and the team, she was being systematically underutilized in a way that suggested bias rather than legitimate concerns about capability. The realization brought with it a choice that she had been avoiding for months. She could continue accepting assignments that failed to utilize her full potential, hoping that persistence would eventually overcome prejudice. Or she could take action to address the disparity between her qualifications and her utilization, risking the label of troublemaker that could end her career in special operations. Tomorrow's mission would unfold according to Commander Mitchell's plan, with Sarah providing communications support while others executed the primary objectives. But as she prepared for sleep, she found herself wondering how much longer she could maintain this pattern without losing the sense of purpose that had driven her to seek the most demanding challenges the military could offer. The question that haunted her dreams was not whether she could continue performing her assigned role with professionalism and excellence. She knew she could do that indefinitely. The question was whether she should. The mission to Syria began exactly as Sarah had predicted it would. The helicopter carried her team through the pre-dawn darkness while she monitored communications from her position near the aircraft's door. Below, the desert landscape scrolled past in shades of black and gray, punctuated by occasional lights from scattered settlements. 2 minutes to target, the pilot announced through the internal communications system. Sarah verified contact with base command and confirmed that all radio frequencies were clear and operational. Her equipment functioned flawlessly, as it always did, providing the communication backbone that kept the operation connected to higher command and emergency support. Through her headset, she listened to her teammates conduct final weapons checks and review their assault plan. The familiar sounds of preparation filled the aircraft cabin, magazine insertions clicking into place, weapon safeties being tested, equipment straps being adjusted and tightened. "Target acquired," the pilot reported, "setting down in 30 seconds." The compound appeared exactly as the satellite imagery had shown, but Sarah's trained eye immediately noted details that static photos could not convey. The shadows fell differently than expected, creating blind spots that had not been apparent in the briefing materials. Guard positions that had seemed fixed now showed evidence of regular patrol patterns that could complicate the approach. Most significantly, she observed that the narrow alleyway identified as the primary approach route was partially blocked by debris that recent weather had deposited. The obstruction was not insurmountable, but it would force the assault team to move in single file for a longer distance than planned, increasing their exposure to detection and hostile fire. "Command, this is Overwatch," Sarah transmitted to her team leader as the helicopter touched down. "Be advised, primary approach route has partial obstruction from storm debris. Recommend adjusting to secondary route or accounting for increased exposure time." Commander Mitchell's voice crackled through the radio. "Acknowledged, Overwatch, will adapt as needed." The response was professionally polite, but carried an undertone that Sarah had learned to recognize. It was the tone of someone acknowledging information while simultaneously dismissing its importance. Her tactical observations, no matter how accurate or relevant, rarely seemed to influence operational decisions. Sarah watched through night vision equipment as her teammates moved away from the aircraft and disappeared into the maze of streets surrounding their target. Their movements were fluid and professional, the product of countless hours of training and real-world experience. But she could see that they were indeed following the original approach route, apparently disregarding her warning about the obstruction. "Movement in Building 2, she reported, tracking thermal signatures through her enhanced optics. 2 individuals, possibly civilians, upper floor." "Copy that, Overwatch. Continue monitoring." The assault team reached the compound perimeter ahead of schedule, their movements invisible to anyone without advanced surveillance equipment. Sarah tracked their progress through a combination of radio reports and direct observation, maintaining the communication link that would prove critical if anything went wrong. And something did go wrong, exactly as her tactical analysis had suggested it might. "Contact front," Rodriguez's voice exploded through the radio, taking fire from multiple positions. The narrow alleyway that Sarah had warned about became a killing ground as enemy fighters opened fire from concealed positions. Her teammates found themselves trapped in a confined space with limited options for maneuver or return fire. The debris obstruction that she had identified forced them into a tactical bottleneck that enemy forces exploited ruthlessly. "Overwatch, we need immediate extraction support." Mitchell's voice had lost its calm professionalism, replaced by the urgent edge of a leader whose plan was disintegrating under enemy contact. Sarah keyed her radio to coordinate with base command and aviation assets, while simultaneously tracking the tactical situation through her optics. The scene below was rapidly deteriorating into the kind of complex emergency that tested every aspect of special operations training. "Command, this is Overwatch. Team is pinned down in grid square 347,629. Request immediate air support and prepare for emergency extraction." Through her equipment, she could see that 2 team members had been separated from the main group during the initial contact. They were positioned behind inadequate cover, taking fire from at least 3 different directions, with enemy forces moving to surround their position. The tactical situation was clear to Sarah's trained eye. The enemy had anticipated the assault team's approach and prepared an ambush that exploited the exact vulnerabilities she had identified. The confined space that forced single-file movement had become a trap, while the debris obstruction prevented rapid withdrawal to more defensible positions. "Johnson and Stevens are cut off," Kane's voice reported through increasing static as enemy jamming began affecting communications. "We can't reach them without exposing the entire team." Sarah analyzed the compound layout through her optics, comparing what she observed with the memorized intelligence reports. There was an alternative approach route that had been dismissed during planning because it required crossing an open courtyard. But from her elevated position, she could see that the courtyard was actually sheltered from the main enemy positions by a combination of structural walls and abandoned vehicles. More importantly, she could see that Johnson and Stevens were positioned near a window that connected to a stairwell leading directly to that courtyard. If someone could reach them from that direction, they could be extracted without requiring the main team to advance through the kill zone that the alleyway had become. "Command, this is Overwatch," she transmitted urgently. "I have eyes on an alternative extraction route for Johnson and Stevens. Northwest stairwell leads to covered courtyard position." "Negative, Overwatch. Too dangerous to split forces further." But Sarah could see what Mitchell could not. Enemy fighters were already moving to surround the trapped operators, and within minutes, their position would become completely untenable. The conventional extraction approaches that Mitchell was considering would require the main team to fight through prepared positions while under heavy fire. The alternative required someone to fast rope from the helicopter, cross the courtyard under cover of darkness, and guide the trapped operators back along the protected route. It was dangerous, but far less so than allowing the current tactical situation to deteriorate further. "Sir, I can provide direct assistance," Sarah transmitted, knowing even as she spoke that the offer would be rejected. "Negative, Overwatch. Maintain communications and coordinate support." Through her optics, Sarah watched enemy forces continue their encirclement while her teammates' ammunition began running low. The jamming was intensifying, making radio communications increasingly difficult. Soon, the command structure that kept operations coordinated would break down entirely. She faced a decision that would define not just this mission, but possibly her entire career. She could follow orders and remain in her assigned position while watching the tactical situation collapse. Or she could take action based on her superior understanding of the battlefield, knowing that such initiative would be seen as insubordination regardless of its effectiveness. "Pilot, prepare for fast rope deployment," she instructed, moving toward the helicopter's deployment position. "Martinez, I don't have orders for that," the pilot responded hesitantly. "You have them now. Emergency extraction of wounded personnel." The pilot hesitated, but the urgency in Sarah's voice and the obvious deterioration of the situation below convinced him to comply. Sarah clipped onto the fast rope system, checking her equipment one final time before stepping into the night air. The descent took only seconds, but it felt like an eternity as enemy fire erupted around the helicopter. Sarah hit the ground in the exact position she had identified through her aerial reconnaissance, finding herself in the covered courtyard with clear access to the stairwell where Johnson and Stevens were trapped. Moving through the building required all the close-quarters combat skills she had perfected during countless training exercises. Each doorway presented a potential threat, each corner concealed possible enemy positions. But her movements were precise and methodical, guided by the tactical awareness that had been dismissed by her commanders but proven accurate by events. She found Johnson and Stevens exactly where her analysis had indicated, pinned down by fire from multiple directions, but still capable of movement. Both operators were wounded but mobile, and their surprise at seeing her was evident even through their professional composure. "Martinez, what the hell are you doing here?" Johnson demanded. "Getting you out," she replied simply, already moving toward the stairwell that would take them to safety. The extraction required fighting through two enemy positions that had moved to block the route, but Sarah's superior knowledge of the building layout allowed her to outmaneuver hostile forces. Her accurate fire and aggressive movement cleared the path for the wounded operators, enabling them to reach the courtyard where helicopter extraction was possible. "Overwatch to command," she transmitted as they reached the extraction point. "Package secured, ready for immediate pickup." The helicopter appeared overhead within minutes, its crew already prepared for emergency extraction procedures. Sarah provided covering fire while Johnson and Stevens were lifted to safety, then followed them up the rescue cable as enemy forces converged on their former position. As the aircraft climbed away from the compound, the main assault team successfully withdrew from their positions, having accomplished their primary mission objectives while Sarah had been conducting the unauthorized rescue operation. The combination of regular mission success and her improvised extraction created a complex situation that defied easy categorization. During the flight back to base, the atmosphere in the helicopter was charged with unspoken tension. Sarah had undoubtedly saved the lives of two fellow operators, but she had also directly violated orders in doing so. The success of her actions could not erase the fact that she had abandoned her assigned position without authorization. Commander Mitchell's expression was unreadable as he reviewed the mission results during their return flight. Johnson and Stevens owed their lives to Sarah's initiative, but her unauthorized departure from communications duty had left the team without their primary radio operator during critical phases of the operation. The contradiction highlighted the impossible situation Sarah found herself in. Following orders would have meant watching fellow operators die when she possessed the capability to save them. Violating orders to preserve life meant accepting responsibility for insubordination that could end her career in special operations. Martinez, Mitchell finally spoke as the coastline of California appeared ahead of them. We'll discuss your actions during debrief. The tone conveyed neither approval nor condemnation, leaving Sarah to wonder whether her career-defining decision would be viewed as heroic initiative or dangerous insubordination. The uncertainty reflected the broader challenge she faced in a community where her gender made every action subject to different standards and interpretations. Landing at base felt like stepping into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. Word of the unauthorized extraction had preceded their return, and Sarah could sense the divided opinions her actions had generated. Some personnel viewed her initiative as exactly what special operations demanded, the willingness to adapt and take risks to accomplish the mission. Others saw it as evidence that female operators could not be trusted to follow orders under pressure. The medical bay processed Johnson and Stevens efficiently, treating their wounds while gathering initial reports about their experiences during the failed assault. Both operators credited Sarah with saving their lives, but their testimonials carried complex implications for her future in the unit. As Sarah cleaned her equipment and prepared for what would certainly be an intensive debrief session, she reflected on the events that had forced her hand. Every tactical decision she had made proved correct, from identifying the approach route vulnerability to recognizing the alternative extraction opportunity. Her combat performance had been flawless, her risk assessment accurate, her execution precise. Yet she knew that the focus of the coming investigation would not be on the tactical merits of her actions, but on her decision to abandon assigned duties without explicit authorization. The same initiative that was praised in male operators would be scrutinized as insubordination when displayed by the unit's only female member. The irony was bitter but familiar. She had spent months proving her capability through training scores and mission performance, only to have her competence questioned when she actually demonstrated the tactical judgment and combat effectiveness that special operations required. Commander Mitchell appeared in the equipment bay as Sarah completed her post-mission procedures. His presence signaled that the reckoning she had anticipated was about to begin, and that her future in special operations would be determined by how military bureaucracy chose to interpret her life-saving initiative. Martinez, you're wanted in the commander's office, now. The administrative hearing that followed the Syrian mission was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her military career. The conference room at Naval Special Warfare Command had been transformed into a formal proceedings venue, complete with a court reporter and an investigating officer whose expression suggested the outcome had already been predetermined. Commander Mitchell sat at one end of the table, flanked by two senior officers Sarah didn't recognize. Their dress uniforms and official demeanor marked them as personnel who specialized in military justice rather than combat operations. Across from them, Sarah occupied a single chair, still wearing the utilities she had barely had time to change into after the mission debrief. Lieutenant Martinez, the investigating officer began, consulting a thick folder of documents. You stand accused of willful disobedience of orders during combat operations, abandonment of assigned duties, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. How do you respond to these charges? The formal language felt surreal after the life-and-death intensity of the previous day's operation. Sarah had spent the night replaying her decisions, analyzing whether alternative actions might have achieved the same results without violating military protocol. Each scenario she considered led to the same conclusion. Following orders would have meant accepting casualties that her intervention had prevented. I acknowledge that I left my assigned position without explicit authorization, Sarah replied carefully. My actions were motivated by the tactical situation and the immediate threat to fellow operators. Lieutenant, the tactical situation you refer to was being managed by your commanding officer according to established protocols. Your decision to abandon communications duty left the team without critical support during a combat operation. Sarah chose her words carefully, aware that everything she said would become part of her permanent record. Sir, the communications equipment remained functional during my absence, and radio contact was maintained through backup systems. My assessment was that the immediate threat to Johnson and Stevens required intervention that only I was positioned to provide. Commander Mitchell leaned forward, his expression reflecting the complex position he occupied as both her immediate superior and a witness to her unauthorized actions. Martinez, explain your assessment of the tactical situation that led to your decision. This was the moment Sarah had been preparing for since learning about the hearing. She needed to demonstrate that her actions were the result of professional judgment rather than impulsive insubordination. But she also knew that defending her decision too aggressively could be interpreted as questioning the competence of her commanding officers. Sir, my elevated position provided visual confirmation of enemy movements that were not apparent to ground forces. I observed hostile elements maneuvering to surround the trapped operators, with an estimated time to complete encirclement of less than 10 minutes. The alternative extraction route I identified offered the only practical means of reaching them before their position became completely untenable. The investigating officer made notes while Sarah spoke, his expression neutral but attentive. Lieutenant, did you communicate this assessment to your commanding officer before taking action? I did, sir. I transmitted my observations and recommendations through established channels. And how did Commander Mitchell respond to your recommendations? Sarah glanced at Mitchell, who nodded for her to continue. He acknowledged the information but indicated that existing plans would remain in effect. So you were explicitly told to maintain your position and continue communications duties. Yes, sir. Yet you chose to disobey those orders. The question hung in the air like an accusation, demanding an answer that would either justify her actions or condemn her career. Sarah had rehearsed various responses, but sitting in the formal hearing room, she realized that the truth was both simpler and more complex than any explanation she could offer. I chose to act on information that indicated fellow operators were in immediate mortal danger, and that I possessed the capability to intervene effectively. Lieutenant, the military operates on the principle that orders must be followed regardless of individual assessments. If every service member chose which orders to obey based on their personal judgment, military discipline would cease to exist. Sarah understood the principle being articulated, and she genuinely respected the necessity of military hierarchy and discipline. But the abstract principle felt inadequate when measured against the reality of watching fellow operators face certain death while possessing the capability to prevent it. Sir, I understand the importance of following orders, but I also understand that special operations requires personnel capable of initiative and adaptation when circumstances exceed planned parameters. The investigating officer exchanged glances with his colleagues, their expressions suggesting that Sarah's response had been anticipated. Lieutenant Martinez, initiative and adaptation within the framework of assigned responsibilities is expected. Abandoning assigned duties to pursue unauthorized actions is insubordination. The hearing continued for 3 hours, with testimony from other team members, analysis of radio transcripts, and detailed examination of Sarah's service record. Johnson and Stevens both testified that her intervention had saved their lives, but their gratitude was tempered by acknowledgement that she had violated clear orders in doing so. Petty Officer Rodriguez testified that Sarah's absence from communications duty had created unnecessary complications during the extraction phase, though he admitted that backup systems had functioned adequately. His testimony carried an undertone of disapproval that went beyond the specific incident, suggesting deeper concerns about her presence on the team. Lieutenant Commander Kane provided the most balanced testimony, acknowledging both the effectiveness of Sarah's actions and the problems created by her unauthorized departure from assigned duties. His assessment was professional and measured, but it ultimately supported the conclusion that she had violated military discipline regardless of her motivations. When the formal testimony concluded, Sarah was given an opportunity to make a final statement. She had spent the hearing listening to her actions dissected and analyzed by people who had not witnessed the tactical situation firsthand. Their focus on protocol and procedure, while understandable, seemed to miss the essential reality that 2 lives had been at stake. Sirs, I enlisted in the Navy to serve my country and protect my fellow service members. I pursued special operations because I believed my capabilities could make the greatest difference in the most challenging circumstances. Everything I have done in my military career has been guided by those principles. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. The decision I made in Syria was not taken lightly, nor was it motivated by disrespect for authority. I acted because the tactical situation demanded immediate intervention, and I possessed both the capability and the positioning to provide it effectively. I understand that my actions violated established protocol, and I accept responsibility for that violation. But I cannot accept that following orders was more important than saving the lives of fellow operators when I had the ability to do so. The investigating officer nodded politely, but his expression suggested that her statement had not changed the fundamental assessment of her actions. The hearing was officially concluded with the promise that a decision would be rendered within 72 hours. Sarah left the conference room knowing that her career in special operations hung in the balance. The successful rescue of Johnson and Stevens would be weighed against her violation of direct orders, with her future determined by how military leadership chose to interpret the balance between initiative and discipline. The next 3 days passed in a strange limbo where Sarah continued her regular duties while awaiting the outcome of the hearing. Her teammates' reactions varied from supportive to disapproving, reflecting broader divisions within the special operations community about her place and performance. Some operators approached her privately to express support for her actions, acknowledging that they would have made the same decision in similar circumstances. Others maintained professional distance, apparently viewing her unauthorized initiative as evidence of unreliability under pressure. The division was particularly stark among the leadership. Younger officers seemed more willing to view her actions as appropriate tactical adaptation, while senior personnel emphasized the dangerous precedent of subordinates choosing which orders to follow based on personal assessment. Commander Mitchell maintained official neutrality, but Sarah detected undercurrents in their interactions that suggested he was struggling with his own assessment of the situation. As her immediate superior, he bore responsibility for both her actions and the circumstances that had led to them. On the 3rd day, Sarah was summoned back to the same conference room where her hearing had been conducted. The investigating officer waited alone this time, with a single folder containing what she assumed was the official decision regarding her fate. Lieutenant Martinez, after careful consideration of all testimony and evidence, the investigating panel has reached its conclusion regarding your actions during the Syria operation. Sarah stood at attention, preparing herself for whatever judgment had been rendered. Her military career had been built on accepting responsibility for both success and failure, and she was prepared to do so again regardless of the consequences. The panel finds that you did willfully disobey direct orders and abandon assigned duties during combat operations. These actions constitute violations of military discipline that cannot be overlooked regardless of their ultimate outcome. The words confirmed Sarah's expectations, but hearing them spoken officially still felt like a physical blow. She had known that her violation of orders would be difficult to excuse, even given the successful results of her unauthorized actions. However, the panel also recognizes that your actions were motivated by legitimate tactical concerns and resulted in the preservation of American lives. Your service record demonstrates consistent excellence and commitment that weighs in favor of mitigation rather than severe punishment. Sarah remained at attention, uncertain whether the qualified condemnation was leading toward career-ending sanctions or some form of administrative discipline that would allow her to continue serving. Therefore, the panel recommends that you receive a formal letter of reprimand for violation of orders to be placed in your personnel file. Additionally, you will be temporarily reassigned to individual training duties while your team leadership evaluates your suitability for continued special operations service. The decision was neither vindication nor condemnation, but something more complex that reflected the ambiguous nature of her situation. The formal reprimand would permanently mark her record potentially limiting future advancement opportunities. But the recommendation for continued evaluation suggested that her special operations career was not necessarily over. "Do you understand the terms of this decision, Lieutenant?" "Yes, sir." "Do you accept the findings and recommendations of this panel?" Sarah considered the question carefully. Accepting the decision would mean acknowledging that her life-saving actions had been inappropriate, despite their successful outcome. Challenging the decision would likely result in more severe consequences and definitive end to her special operations career. "I accept the panel's authority to render this decision, sir." The careful phrasing acknowledged the official outcome while avoiding explicit agreement with the underlying assessment of her actions. It was a diplomatic response that preserved her ability to maintain professional relationships while protecting her personal conviction that she had made the correct choice. Walking away from the conference room for the second time, Sarah reflected on the strange position she now occupied. She had saved 2 lives and successfully completed an unauthorized rescue mission that demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical competence and combat effectiveness that special operations demanded. Yet she was being punished for displaying those very qualities because they had been exercised outside the approved chain of command. The contradiction highlighted the broader challenges she faced as the only female member of a community that remained uncertain about how to evaluate and utilize her capabilities. Every action was scrutinized through multiple lenses, with gender considerations complicating assessments that would be straightforward for male operators. As she prepared for temporary reassignment to training duties, Sarah wondered whether her demonstration of tactical excellence under pressure had ultimately advanced or hindered her long-term goal of being accepted as an equal member of the Special Operations community. The individual training unit at Naval Special Warfare Command occupied a collection of weathered buildings that had seen decades of elite operators pass through their doors. For Sarah, assignment to ITU represented both a professional setback and an unexpected opportunity. While her teammates deployed on missions she should have been participating in, she found herself responsible for training the next generation of special operations personnel. The irony was not lost on her. Despite being formally reprimanded for unauthorized initiative, she was now tasked with developing those exact qualities in trainees who would face similar life-and-death decisions in their own careers. The contradiction reflected the complex position she occupied within an organization struggling to reconcile traditional military discipline with the adaptive leadership that modern warfare required. Her first assignment involved instructing advanced close-quarters combat techniques to a class of 24 students from various special operations units. These were not fresh recruits, but experienced operators seeking specialized training in urban warfare and hostage rescue scenarios. Many had already deployed multiple times and possessed combat experience that commanded respect. "Today we're covering multi-room clearing procedures in structures with unknown layouts," Sarah announced to the assembled class. "The techniques we'll practice are designed for situations where intelligence is limited and enemy positions are uncertain." The students listened attentively, their notebooks open and weapons cleaned for the practical exercises that would follow. Sarah had learned to gauge her audience quickly, identifying those who were genuinely interested in improving their skills versus those who attended training as a mandatory requirement. What she hadn't expected was the challenge of earning credibility with students who knew about her recent disciplinary action. Word traveled fast in the special operations community, and her unauthorized rescue mission in Syria had become a topic of discussion in barracks and training facilities throughout the command. Sergeant First Class David Kim, an Army Ranger with 3 combat deployments, raised his hand during the initial briefing. "Ma'am, can you walk us through the decision-making process when standard procedures don't match the tactical situation?" The question was professionally phrased, but Sarah detected the underlying challenge in his tone. Kim was testing whether she would address the elephant in the room or attempt to avoid discussing her recent actions. "That's an excellent question, Sergeant Kim. In dynamic tactical environments, operators must balance adherence to established procedures with the need to adapt to changing circumstances. The key is ensuring that any deviation from standard protocols is based on clear tactical advantages rather than personal preferences." She paused, making eye contact with each student before continuing. "However, It's crucial to understand that tactical adaptation must occur within the framework of lawful orders and military discipline. Personal initiative should enhance mission effectiveness, not replace proper command authority. The response acknowledged her Syria experience without explicitly defending her actions, striking a balance that allowed the training to proceed without becoming a debate about her disciplinary case. Several students nodded approvingly, recognizing the professional way she had addressed a potentially awkward topic. The practical portion of the training took place in the Kill House, a specially constructed facility designed to simulate various urban combat scenarios. Students worked in pairs, clearing rooms while Sarah observed their techniques and provided immediate feedback on their performance. During these exercises, Sarah's expertise became unmistakably evident. Her ability to analyze tactical situations, identify weaknesses in technique, and provide specific guidance for improvement exceeded what most students had experienced from other instructors. The knowledge she shared came not just from textbook study, but from practical application under actual combat conditions. "Wilson, you're telegraphing your movement by leading with your weapon," Sarah called out during one exercise. "The muzzle flash gives away your position before you can assess the room. Try angling your approach to minimize exposure while maintaining visual coverage." The correction was precise and immediately applicable, resulting in noticeably improved performance when the student repeated the exercise. Such specific guidance, delivered with clear understanding of its practical application, gradually earned Sarah respect that transcended any concerns about her disciplinary status. Master Chief Petty Officer Robert Hayes, the senior enlisted instructor at ITU, observed several of Sarah's training sessions before approaching her for a private conversation. Hayes was a 25-year veteran whose reputation for developing exceptional operators was legendary throughout the special operations community. "Martinez, I've been watching your classes," Hayes said as they reviewed training schedules in his office. "Your students are showing improvement curves that typically take twice as long to achieve." Sarah appreciated the recognition, but she sensed that Hayes had additional observations to share. His tone suggested this conversation was leading toward something more significant than routine performance evaluation. "Thank you, Master Chief. The students are motivated and experienced. They make teaching easier." "It's more than that," Hayes continued. "You're connecting tactical theory with practical application in ways that most instructors struggle with. Your combat experience gives your instruction a credibility that classroom knowledge can't match." Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah's expression carefully. "I'm curious about something, though. How do you reconcile teaching initiative and tactical adaptation while serving under disciplinary action for those exact qualities?" The question cut to the heart of the contradiction Sarah faced daily. She was expected to develop in students the same tactical judgment that had gotten her formally reprimanded when she exercised it herself. The double standard was particularly stark given that her unauthorized actions had achieved their intended results. "Master Chief, I believe there's a difference between tactical adaptation within assigned roles and abandoning assigned duties entirely. My job here is to help students develop judgment that enhances mission effectiveness without compromising command structure." "That's a diplomatic answer," Hayes replied with a slight smile. "But what do you really think about the situation?" Sarah considered how much candor was appropriate in this conversation. Hayes was senior enlisted leadership whose opinions carried significant weight in determining her future assignments. But his question suggested he was genuinely interested in her perspective rather than testing her for proper deference to authority. "Honestly, Master Chief, I think the special operations community is struggling with how to balance individual initiative with military discipline. Modern warfare requires operators who can think independently and adapt rapidly, but military organizations need predictable chains of command. Sometimes those requirements conflict. And when they do conflict, that's when operators have to make decisions that someone else will judge after the fact, based on information that may not reflect the reality of the tactical situation." Hayes nodded slowly, his expression suggesting that her answer had confirmed suspicions he already held. "Martinez, I'm going to share something with you that stays in this office. There's been discussion at senior levels about your case, and not all of it has been critical of your actions." Sarah felt a surge of interest but maintained her professional composure. Information about high-level discussions regarding her situation could provide insight into her future prospects within the special operations community. Some senior officers believe that your Syria actions demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical judgment and combat effectiveness that we're trying to develop in our operators. They argue that punishing successful initiative sends the wrong message about what the community values. And others disagree. Others worry that excusing disobedience, even successful disobedience, undermines the command authority that keeps operations coordinated and safe. They argue that individual initiative must be channeled through proper command structures to be effective. The explanation reflected the same tension Sarah had been wrestling with since the Syria mission. Both perspectives had merit, but their conflict created an impossible situation for operators who found themselves facing tactical decisions that existing protocols had not anticipated. Master Chief, where does that leave my situation? Still being determined, Hayes replied honestly. But I can tell you that your performance here has been noted by people who matter. Your ability to translate combat experience into effective training is exactly what ITU needs. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. A young petty officer entered with a message that required Sarah's immediate attention. One of her students had been injured during a training exercise and required her presence at the medical facility. Racing across the base to the medical building, Sarah reflected on her conversation with Hayes. The information he had shared suggested that her future in special operations remained undecided at the highest levels of command. Her performance as an instructor was apparently providing evidence that could support either continued service or transition to different duties. At the medical facility, she found Sergeant Kim receiving treatment for a training injury that was serious but not life-threatening. The accident had occurred during an advanced rappelling exercise when his equipment had malfunctioned, resulting in a fall that injured his shoulder and back. "How are you feeling, Sergeant?" Sarah asked as medical personnel completed their examination. "I'll live, ma'am. Equipment failure happens, just bad timing." But as Sarah reviewed the incident report and inspected the failed equipment, she began to suspect that the accident might not have been the result of random mechanical failure. The rappelling gear showed signs of wear that should have been detected during routine inspection, suggesting possible negligence in equipment maintenance. Her investigation uncovered a pattern of deferred maintenance on training equipment that created unnecessary risks for students. Budget constraints and personnel shortages had led to informal decisions to extend service intervals for equipment that required more frequent inspection and replacement. The discovery placed Sarah in another difficult position. Reporting the maintenance problems would protect student safety, but would also create complications for ITU leadership who were already dealing with resource limitations. Remaining silent would avoid administrative problems, but would perpetuate conditions that endangered the personnel she was responsible for training. Once again, she found herself facing a choice between following expected protocols and taking action based on her professional assessment of a dangerous situation. The parallel to her Syria experience was obvious, but this time the stakes involved training safety rather than combat effectiveness. Sarah chose to document her findings thoroughly and submit a formal report through proper channels. The investigation that followed confirmed her assessment and resulted in immediate changes to equipment maintenance procedures. But her role in exposing the problems also created tension with some ITU personnel who viewed her report as criticizing their competence. The incident reinforced her reputation as someone willing to challenge established practices when safety or effectiveness was at stake. Whether this reputation would ultimately help or hinder her career remained unclear, but it clearly distinguished her from personnel who prioritized administrative harmony over operational excellence. As weeks passed, Sarah's students continued to demonstrate exceptional progress under her instruction. Their performance on final evaluations exceeded program averages by significant margins, providing objective evidence of her effectiveness as an instructor. But she remained uncertain whether teaching excellence would be sufficient to overcome the disciplinary mark on her record. The answer came in an unexpected form when Master Chief Hayes informed her that a senior officer would be visiting ITU to observe training operations. The visit was described as routine oversight, but Hayes suggested that the timing was related to ongoing discussions about Sarah's future assignment. "Who's coming?" Sarah asked. "General Patricia Morrison, Deputy Commander of Special Operations Command. She's making ITU part of a broader review of training effectiveness across the Special Operations community." The name was familiar to Sarah as one of the highest-ranking female officers in Special Operations, someone whose career had blazed trails that made Sarah's own service possible. Morrison's visit would likely include observation of multiple training programs, but Sarah suspected that her own classes would receive particular attention. Preparing for the visit required ensuring that all training programs met the highest standards of safety and effectiveness. Sarah worked with her students to refine their techniques and review complex scenarios that would demonstrate their capabilities under pressure. But as the visit approached, she found herself wondering whether this would be an opportunity to demonstrate her value to the Special Operations community, or a final evaluation before reassignment to duties outside her chosen specialty. The uncertainty added weight to every training decision and every interaction with students who had come to respect her expertise. General Patricia Morrison arrived at Naval Special Warfare Command on a crisp Tuesday morning that would prove to be a turning point in Sarah's career. The four-star general's reputation preceded her, a legendary figure who had broken barriers throughout her military service while earning the respect of every special operations community in the armed forces. Sarah first glimpsed the general during the formal welcome ceremony held in the main courtyard. Morrison was smaller in stature than Sarah had expected, but her presence commanded immediate attention from everyone in attendance. When she spoke to the assembled personnel, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone whose competence had been proven under the most demanding circumstances. "I'm here to observe how we're preparing the next generation of special operations personnel," Morrison announced to the gathering. "Our training programs must evolve to meet emerging threats while maintaining the standards of excellence that define our community." The statement seemed routine, but Sarah detected undertones that suggested the general's visit had purposes beyond standard oversight. Morrison's emphasis on excellence and evolution implied that she was evaluating not just training effectiveness, but broader questions about how the special operations community identified and utilized talent. After the formal ceremony, Morrison began a series of visits to different training facilities across the base. Sarah learned that the general's schedule included observation of multiple programs, with her own close-quarters combat class listed for the following afternoon. That evening, Sarah worked late to ensure her training materials were properly organized, and her lesson plan reflected the most current tactical developments. She had taught the same advanced room-clearing techniques dozens of times, but tomorrow's session would be observed by someone whose assessment could determine her entire career trajectory. The training facility was immaculate when Sarah arrived the next morning, her students already present and conducting preliminary equipment checks. Sergeant Kim, now recovered from his training injury, had volunteered to assist with demonstrations despite being officially released from the program. "Ma'am, how do you want to handle the general's visit?" asked Staff Sergeant Williams, one of her more experienced students. "Same as every other training session," Sarah replied. "We'll focus on the techniques and their practical application. The general didn't come here to see a show, she wants to evaluate training effectiveness." At precisely 1400 hours, General Morrison entered the training facility accompanied by Master Chief Hayes and two staff officers Sarah didn't recognize. The general wore standard battle dress uniform without the ceremonial decorations that marked formal occasions, suggesting she intended to observe actual training rather than staged demonstrations. "General Morrison, welcome to Advanced Close Quarters Combat Training," Sarah announced, bringing the class to attention. "Carry on, Lieutenant Martinez. I'm here to observe, not interrupt." Morrison positioned herself where she could observe both Sarah's instruction and student responses, her expression neutral but attentive. Her staff officers took notes throughout the session, but the general focused entirely on the training itself. Sarah began with a review of basic room-clearing principles before moving to more complex scenarios involving multiple rooms and unknown enemy positions. Her students performed with the precision that reflected weeks of intensive training under her guidance. "The key to successful room clearing is information management," Sarah explained as students prepared for practical exercises. You need to gather intelligence about threats and layout while minimizing your exposure time. Speed without accuracy is useless, but accuracy without speed gets you killed. The practical exercise involved a simulated hostage rescue scenario in a building with multiple rooms and hidden threats. Students worked in pairs, with Sarah providing real-time feedback on their tactical decisions and execution. During one particularly challenging exercise, student Miller hesitated at a doorway where conflicting visual cues suggested both civilian presence and possible hostile positions. The scenario was designed to test decision-making under ambiguous circumstances. "Miller, talk me through what you're seeing," Sarah instructed. "Ma'am, I have movement in the room, but I can't confirm threat identification. The positioning suggests civilians, but the movement patterns are inconsistent with non-combatant behavior." "What's your decision?" Miller paused, clearly weighing options that could result in either civilian casualties or operator vulnerability. "I'm going to use the angled approach to gain better visual confirmation before committing to entry." "Execute." Miller's subsequent movement demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical thinking that distinguished exceptional operators from merely competent ones. His approach balanced caution with decisiveness, gathering necessary information while maintaining operational momentum. General Morrison watched the exercise intently, her expression revealing nothing about her assessment of what she was observing. But Sarah noticed that the general paid particular attention to the instructional techniques being used and the learning outcomes demonstrated by students. After the formal training session concluded, Morrison approached Sarah while students secured their equipment and prepared for evening meal formation. The general's expression remained neutral, but her decision to initiate private conversation suggested that her assessment had been significant. "Lieutenant Martinez, walk with me." They left the training facility and moved toward a quieter area of the base where their conversation could proceed without interruption. Sarah maintained professional posture while trying to gauge Morrison's intentions from her body language and tone. "I've reviewed your service record," Morrison began without preamble. "Your qualification scores, mission performance, and training effectiveness all demonstrate exceptional capability, but I'm also aware of the disciplinary actions stemming from your Syria deployment." Sarah chose her response carefully. "Yes, ma'am, I accept responsibility for violating orders during that operation." "Tell me about your decision-making process during that incident." The question invited explanation rather than demanding justification, but Sarah knew that her answer would be crucial in determining Morrison's assessment of her character and judgment. She had rehearsed various responses, but facing the general directly, she realized that only complete honesty would be appropriate. "General, I observed a tactical situation where fellow operators were in immediate mortal danger, and I possessed the capability to intervene effectively. The established protocols for that situation would have resulted in casualties that I believed I could prevent." Morrison nodded slightly, encouraging her to continue. "I understood that my actions violated orders, and I accepted that my career might end as a result. But I couldn't reconcile following commands with watching fellow service members die when I had the ability to save them." "And if you faced that same situation again?" The question cut to the heart of whether Sarah had learned to subordinate individual judgment to military discipline, or whether she remained someone who might prioritize tactical effectiveness over command authority. "I hope I would never face that situation again, ma'am, but if I did, I would probably make the same choice." Morrison stopped walking and turned to face Sarah directly. Her expression remained neutral, but her next words carried implications that extended far beyond this single conversation. "Lieutenant Martinez, the Special Operations community is evolving to meet threats that our traditional training never anticipated. We need operators who can think independently, adapt rapidly, and make decisions under pressure that others will evaluate after the fact." Sarah listened intently, uncertain whether Morrison's comments were leading toward vindication or further criticism of her Syria actions. "At the same time, we must maintain the command structure and discipline that allows complex operations to succeed. Individual initiative must enhance rather than replace proper command authority." The general resumed walking, her pace deliberate and unhurried. Your training performance here demonstrates that you understand this balance. Your students are learning not just techniques, but the judgment required to apply them effectively under various circumstances. They reached a bench overlooking the Pacific Ocean, where Morrison gestured for Sarah to sit beside her. The informal setting suggested that their conversation was moving beyond official assessment toward something more personal. "I want to share something with you that's not widely known," Morrison said. "Early in my career, I faced a situation similar to yours. Different circumstances, but the same conflict between following orders and taking action I believed was necessary." Sarah felt a surge of surprise and interest, but maintained her professional composure. "I chose to follow orders. The operation succeeded according to plan, but people died who might have been saved if I had acted on my tactical assessment instead of adhering to established protocols." Morrison was quiet for a moment, watching waves break against the coastline below. "I've wondered about that decision for 30 years, whether my adherence to discipline was professional excellence or moral cowardice." The revelation transformed Sarah's understanding of why Morrison had requested this private conversation. The general was not just evaluating Sarah's career prospects, but grappling with fundamental questions about leadership, initiative, and moral responsibility that had shaped her own military service. "General, may I ask what conclusion you've reached?" Morrison smiled slightly, the first display of personal warmth Sarah had seen from her. "That both decisions carry risks, and both require courage. The key is ensuring that whatever choice you make serves the mission and the people you're responsible for. In your case, your choice succeeded in preserving life while accomplishing tactical objectives. That doesn't automatically make it correct, but it demonstrates the kind of judgment and capability that special operations requires." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and anticipation, sensing that Morrison's assessment was moving in a positive direction, but uncertain about its practical implications for her future assignments. "Lieutenant, I'm recommending that you be returned to full operational status with your original unit. The formal reprimand will remain in your file, but it will be accompanied by a commendation for exceptional training performance and tactical excellence under pressure." The announcement was unexpected and overwhelming. Sarah had hoped for eventual return to operational duties, but Morrison's decision represented complete vindication of her capabilities and judgment. "Furthermore," Morrison continued, "I'm recommending that you be considered for advanced leadership training programs. The Special Operations community needs officers who can balance initiative with discipline, and your experience provides valuable perspective on that balance." Standing from the bench, Morrison extended her hand to Sarah. "Lieutenant Martinez, you've demonstrated exactly the qualities we need in our future leaders. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." As they walked back toward the main base, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary turn her career had taken. The unauthorized rescue mission that had nearly ended her special operations service had ultimately led to recognition from the highest levels of military leadership. More importantly, Morrison's support represented acknowledgement that the special operations community was evolving to embrace the kind of tactical judgment and adaptive leadership that Sarah had demonstrated, even when those qualities conflicted with traditional command structures. The following week, Sarah received official orders returning her to operational status with enhanced responsibilities. Her teammates welcomed her return with genuine enthusiasm, their respect deepened by her successful navigation of the disciplinary process and her demonstrated competence as an instructor. Commander Mitchell approached her on her first day back with the team. "Martinez, I want you to know that your Syria actions have changed how I think about tactical decision-making. Your assessment was correct, and your execution was flawless." The acknowledgement meant more to Sarah than any official commendation could provide. Earning the respect of her immediate commander represented the professional validation she had sought throughout her career. As she prepared for her next deployment, Sarah understood that her journey toward acceptance and recognition within the special operations community was far from complete. But Morrison's intervention had established that her capabilities would be evaluated based on performance rather than preconceptions, creating opportunities that had previously seemed impossible. When General Morrison visited the base again 6 months later, she observed Sarah leading a complex training exercise for senior special operations personnel. Watching from the observation deck, the general smiled as Sarah demonstrated the same tactical excellence and instructional ability that had originally caught her attention. After the exercise, Morrison approached Sarah one final time. "Lieutenant, how are you finding your return to operations?" "Challenging and rewarding, ma'am. The team dynamic has improved significantly, and I'm being utilized in ways that match my capabilities." Morrison nodded approvingly. "That's what I hope to hear. Remember, your success isn't just personal achievement, it's opening doors for everyone who follows." As Morrison walked away, Sarah reflected on the transformation her career had undergone. The female SEAL who had once been treated as invisible now served as a model for how exceptional performance could overcome institutional bias, proving that excellence ultimately transcended all other considerations. The general's salute that day had been more than recognition of Sarah's individual achievements. It had been acknowledgement that the special operations community was finally ready to embrace the full spectrum of talent and capability that America's warriors could provide, regardless of gender or background. Sarah's journey from invisibility to recognition had required courage, persistence, and willingness to risk everything for what she believed was right. But it had also required leaders like Morrison who were willing to look beyond tradition to see potential and capability wherever it existed. The story that began with a female SEAL struggling for recognition had evolved into something larger, a testament to how individual excellence could drive institutional change, creating opportunities for future generations who would never know the barriers that had once seemed insurmountable.